The lizard the size of Tony. We'll just put it that way.
Wow, that's huge. Right. Yeah, I mean,
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Billy Brown. I've also got our other co-host,
Tony Crosdale. It's been a while.
It's a lot of fun to be back together. And we've got, who's our third person? Go ahead, real quick.
All right, my name is Ivan Kwan. I am from Singapore, and I am a nature guide over here.
Lovely. So before we get into why we're having Ivan on the podcast and a lot of fun stuff about Singapore, I'll do the really basic reminders that if you like our podcast, please like us on your podcast listening platform of choice. Please tell your friends about it, share it on social media. Make sure you listen to all the Wildlife Observer Network podcasts. We got a great family of podcasts now, so please check those out as well. If you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us on email at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. Again, urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Twitter at urbwildlifecast. We've got a Facebook page too, so you can find us there. Please let us know what you're interested in and what you'd like to talk about. And we have Ivan on today because he is a listener, and he might be our most dedicated listener ever. Ivan emailed me, and he said he'd listened to every single podcast episode we ever put up. And at that point, I was like, well, he's got to come on about something. And then he had some great ideas to come on the podcast. So you too, pitch us some ideas that you want to hear on the podcast. We'll get you on here. Tony, real quick, where you been the past few months?
I've been in Dadland, but also, I mean,
Nice.
I with the expansion to the Wildlife Observer Network, I still have been regularly in some people's feeds if they subscribe to the Wildlife Observer Network feed, not just the Urban Wildlife feed. All of the Urban Wildlife feed podcasts are on the Wildlife Observer Network feeds as well. But partly because of me being a new dad, and also partly because of expanding, sometimes Billy will do things on his own without me, just because it's just it's easier to do it that way when we're juggling so many things.
I've been a new dad a couple of times myself. I know what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah. But I got to say, this is very nostalgic. Like, this is where it started, and I almost feel like doing more has made me like appreciate the Urban Wildlife Podcast even more, because it is, I feel like one of the reasons we expanded it was because we felt like we were almost too narrow in scope. But with that said, like, the reason why we started something so narrow is because it's so near and dear to Billy and I's hearts. And so I'm really excited. And I'm excited to be talking to someone from a place I've been to, and one of the places that I think is maybe the best city in the world for urban wildlife, observation. Like, if you really like being in a crazy, metropolis with that's really imposing with, and observing nature, like, I don't know if a better example exists than Singapore.
Hey, I want to do a quick setup for Ivan here, because I remember when this is years ago, we were doing an episode where I wanted to do something about urban pythons in Southeast Asia. And so I was at some forum or online or Facebook or something. I was asking people, who should I talk to about this? And I was like, what about Singapore? And some other herpers were like, nah, don't do Singapore. Singapore, yeah, it's a city, but there's so much green space, it almost doesn't even count as like urban wildlife anymore. Do Bangkok. Bangkok's a real city. And so you're not saying Singapore isn't a city, but for people who've never been there before, talk about what it's like. Like, what's the green space like? What are the urban non-green spaces like? Sort of give us sort of the nature guide's quick overview of what Singapore's like.
All right. So for Singapore, for those of you who don't know much about our little island nation state, we are a tiny little country, just barely north of the equator. And we are a really tiny country. I'm not too sure how large it is relative to some of the US cities, but we lost a lot of our original habitat a long time ago. So we were a British colony from 1819. And along the way, so we've only just celebrated 200 years of Singapore being a thing. Previously, before that, historically, we were part of various other Southeast Asian empires and nation states and all that. But from 1819 onwards, we suffered a lot of deforestation. So originally, we were covered in tropical rainforest, like what you would get in much of Malaysia and Indonesia. Our coastlines were fringed with mangroves and coral reefs and all those other coastal habitats. But a lot of that was lost, not only during the years under the British and also during World War II when we were occupied by the Japanese. But when Singapore became an independent sovereign state in 1965, our development accelerated a lot. So we underwent a lot of reclamation of the coastal areas. So that was when we lost a lot of our coastal mangroves and our coral reefs and a lot of our natural marine habitats. But at the same time, we also underwent a lot of urban greening. So even while we were even after we had lost a great deal of our original primeval habitats, a lot of efforts were being made to plant trees and provide gardens and parks in our urban spaces. So although Singapore is considered, it's quite a urban place, it's very densely populated, but even along most of the streets, everywhere you walk, there are trees lining the sidewalks and along the streets. There are little patches of grasslands. There are flowering shrubs and bushes in every housing estate, everywhere. So we do have some nature reserves that preserve a very small proportion of our original habitats, but we have this very large network of parks and gardens and just roadside urban vegetation that provides habitats for some of the more resilient and adaptable species here in Singapore. So yeah, the reticulated pythons are among those because they use our drains and sewers to move around, and they will sometimes pop out of toilet bowls and they will just sometimes hang around near the outdoor.
I've always wanted that to happen in my house, but it's just never going to happen. that I wake up in the morning and find a python in the bathroom. That just would be. I'm one of the few people in the world who'd be thrilled by that. Go ahead.
Well, we did have some older articles from the 1980s of people sitting on the toilet and they got bitten by a python. So
that's quite a surprise you don't want. Yeah.
Yes.
So before we get, I think I'm gonna claim a little bit of time before I throw it into the birding discussion and then I'll sit back and I think Tony will take it from there. But one of the we were kicking around some ideas by email about what to talk about for the podcast, and I wanted to steer it more towards critters that you'd find in let's say not in the preserve areas, but in the places where people really live and do their business. You had mentioned water monitors, and so talk a little bit about those, because that was you chose it for a good reason. This is a spectacular animal that I would not expect to find in the middle of the city.
Yep. So the Asian water monitor, or also called the Malayan water monitor, it's this pretty large, very imposing, very majestic, large lizard. Gets to about 2 meters in length, sometimes reaching 3 meters. There are apparently some old records of them exceeding 3 meters, which would make them longer than Komodo dragons. I'm not too sure about the reliability of those old records, but they are apparently one of the contenders for the second largest lizard in the world.
The lizard the size of Tony. We'll just put it that way.
Wow, that's huge. Right. I mean, they can get that large, and they do seem to do pretty well in many of our urban parks and even in the urban drainage systems. So for a large lizard that's a carnivore, it's a very adaptable opportunist. So they are predators and also scavengers, and they just seem to thrive on all the other things that live among them in the city. So sometimes people will be walking along the drains and the canals on their way home, or when they're out for a morning or evening run along the canals. And then you'll see this large monitor lizard just either basking in the sun nearby or swimming in the canals, or maybe even just munching on the dead fish that they found. And sometimes these monitor lizards, they will crawl out of the parks and into the housing estates. So sometimes they might just end up at someone's front door, which has happened before for those people who live on the ground floor. And then sometimes because most of our urban residential housing areas, they are high rises and they leave most of the ground floor open. So these are what we call void decks. I don't think there's a term that you hear being used in the US. So these void decks are just basically these open spaces for people to walk through below the blocks. And sometimes people will find monitor lizards just moving around right in the middle of the housing estate. And sometimes they get cornered, and then that's when they have to call the local wildlife rescue services to try to move them away.
So I guess you just mentioned something cool to me. Like, so part of what I was going to ask was, okay, how do people react when they see a large lizard on their morning walk? But the other thing is that you said there's a wildlife services unit that comes and handles wildlife. Can you?
Yes.
What is that?
Okay. So for a long time, this was kind of like a bit like a free for all. So it was up to our own local society for the prevention of cruelty to animals to handle some of these wildlife cases, but their focus is mostly on domestic animals and pets, right? Then we had this charity coming up called Acres. I can't remember the exact definition, what it all stands for, but let me just bring it up. And Acres stands for, let me see, Animal Concerns Research and Education Society. So they are a charity, and they've been doing wildlife rescues 24/7, free of charge for I think pretty much about the last decade. So whenever people call them, there's an injured bird or there's a snake somewhere where they don't want it to be. There's a monitor lizard, a monkey, otters, wild boar, even sometimes for the smaller crocodiles that wander into places that they're not supposed to be. Acres often gets called for this sort of cases. And then recently, our own government service that manages the green spaces and also the biodiversity, the National Parks Board, they also have been involved in quite a number of these wildlife rescue cases. Yeah. So right now we have this few organizations involved in rescuing wildlife from people in most cases.
So let's put a pin in that wild boar comment for some point.
Yeah, and the crocodiles. We'll circle back to the crocodiles
if we've got time at the end. But hey, the other idea was something that I think is much more up Tony's alley, so I'll hand it over to him. But you're talking about the myna birds of Singapore. And so as a guy who knows that myna birds are related to starlings and they're, birds that people sometimes keep in cages, like, what is interesting about the myna birds of Singapore?
Well, the mynas of Singapore is a species that I think a lot of people outside of Southeast Asia are not familiar with. It's called the Javan myna. So in many other places around the world, the common myna or the Indian myna is the one that's been introduced and it's become invasive, right? Over here, the common myna is considered a native. It apparently naturally immigrated here to Singapore from further north, I think sometime in the late 19th or earlier 20th century. So it was a natural colonization, probably in response to ongoing deforestation and development of this region. So the common myna was for the longest time our standard urban scavenger. So in Singapore, we don't have the full unholy trio of urban invasive birds. So we have feral pigeons, definitely. We have a small population of house sparrows. They are very limited in their range. But the common sparrow you see everywhere in the urban landscape is its close relative, the Eurasian tree sparrow. And the European starling, it's not here. I think it's been recorded a few times, but we're not sure whether they are just lost birds from the northern hemisphere or whether they were escapees from captivity and all that. But their close relatives, the miners, they've been doing very well. So the Javan myna is the equivalent of the European starling here in Singapore. It's a very intelligent, adaptable scavenger. So you see pairs of them basically everywhere. They'll be looking for insects and seeds and fruits. Sometimes when you are at the outdoor dining areas at the coffee shops and restaurants, they'll be flying down and swooping on the leftovers when people leave their tables. And then sometimes they even fly into the air-conditioned seating area. So I've seen Javan myna just waiting outside a KFC and then waiting for some customer to open the door, and then you'll swoop in and it will just go around and start eating leftovers until it gets shooed out by the staff, and then after a while it will be coming back in again. And so they're very smart birds. They've even been seen flying into people's kitchens to peck at food that's left unattended. And so they're really brilliant birds, but the thing is that the Javan myna is an invasive species over here in Singapore. So apparently it was brought in as part of the cage bird trade. It got out, it was first recorded, I think, sometime in the 1920s in Singapore. And then it's just been it's been established and it's been thriving ever since. So it is considered.
I'm getting mixed up. So we've got the myna birds. Which species was it that expanded its range spontaneously from the north?
The common or Indian myna.
Got it. So you've got those that sort of naturally came in with deforestation, or spontaneously came in through after deforestation happened, and then the Javan mynas are released cage birds for the most part.
Yep.
What was the default myna, let's say 70 years ago?
I would say probably the common myna. I would think. I definitely wasn't around 70 years ago, but I know,
but yeah.
Okay. Based on the older bird guides we have for the region, I think the common myna was considered the common one.
Okay.
I think they already recorded the Javan myna hanging around the towns and villages during that time, but in recent decades, the Javan myna has really thrived to the point that the common myna is now not so common anymore. So it's basically effectively displaced the common myna. It's still around. You can still find it everywhere in urban areas and in some areas not so close to humans. But the common myna is a much rarer bird these days compared to the Javan myna. So you get flocks of thousands of Javan mynas all coming to roost in the trees in some neighborhoods, and that's when people complain about the noise and the food and all that. So it can be quite a nuisance. The thing is that they don't create the murmurations that you see in the European starling, so they don't have that going for them.
Yeah,
we've discussed common mynas before on this podcast because there is a population in South Florida. And so when I discussed my trip to Miami to see a lot of these alien species that are naturalized in South Florida that you can count on your American Bird Association list, that was one of the ones I saw. They were nesting at a street light.
Yeah, the mynas are very adaptable birds for in the urban landscapes. So they will just nest in all sorts of weird places, behind air conditioners, in gutter pipes and all that.
Hey Tony, so what do you remember from your birding in Singapore?
Well, I'm trying to remember what I saw in just the in the city proper. I'm sure I saw mynas, but mynas are just ubiquitous in cities throughout the world. Mynas are starlings, right? They're just a type of starling. And so starlings, anywhere there's starlings, they're like ubiquitous. Africa has a ton of gorgeous starlings as well. Australia has some. The common mynas also lives there as well. So you kind of almost stop paying attention to mynas. In fact, I was like thinking of looking at my eBird list to see if I recorded Java myna for Singapore, because it might have not have been on my radar that it was a different myna. You just kind of like tune them out because you're so used to seeing them. I might have been, this is, but anyway, so I remember seeing the only bird. It was to Singapore twice, and I went to correct my pronunciation, please, but Sungai Buloh.
Sungai Buloh.
Sungai Buloh, which is one of the greatest places I've ever been.
I used to work there.
Oh, it's maybe the best, has the greatest facilities I've ever seen for a nature reserve in terms of amenities, like all the hides and blinds and observation decks, and the trails were just first class, and the interpretive center was phenomenal. But there, I should go to my list, but I remember I saw milky stork there. I saw white-bellied sea eagles. I saw a whole lot of green shanks and Tarik sandpiper and plovers and like lots of shorebirds. I forget which species of sunbird I saw. So I'm trying to. I should just bring up my eBird list, but although what's funny is at the time, but this is before eBird, and what I would do, or at least before eBird had Asia in it, it only had America at the time, if it even existed then. What I would do is I would just keep a list of new birds for my trip. So even if I would go to a place, I would just write down what was new for me. So so often I might have seen some birds there that I saw in Malaysia or Thailand and didn't record. I remember seeing I almost remember seeing a dollar bird when I was there.
Oh, what?
Okay.
A dollar bird. They're a type of roller. They're big. It's a big chunky songbird that likes to. It's an aerial feeder, and it's kind of like it's almost like a songbird that became a kingfisher. And mind you, in the rest of the world, kingfishers feed as much on terrestrial prey as aquatic prey. So kingfishers, a kookaburra is a kingfisher. So, these are like a big chunky, they eat probably, large insects. And they're really cool looking birds. And they have a big red bill, and they're dark metallic green with these white patches on their wings. They're very, very cool looking bird. So, yeah. But that's where I saw it. The first time I ever saw a saltwater, crocodile.
Oh, yes. I remember you mentioned that before.
And then I went back, the second time we were, Rambo played Singapore twice. And so I went there both times, and I saw a crocodile there the second time, and it may have been the same one even 3 years later. Is that true? But that's what someone told me. But maybe it was you. Maybe I saw you there. But, maybe that 10, 15 years ago. So.
Did you happen to see Taylor's over there? There's a Taylor's crocodile in Sungai Buloh.
It's what?
There's a crocodile without a tail, so we call that crocodile tailless.
Oh, this one had a tail. So,
okay.
But remember, this is like 10, 15 years ago. So,
okay.
Maybe it lost the tail. We don't know.
Maybe. Yeah. So so the Javan myna is abundant in Singapore to the point that it's considered a pest. So it's one of the few species of birds in Singapore that's not protected by law. So in Singapore, most of our wildlife are covered under this legal framework called the Wildlife Act. So only a few small handful of species are not covered. So that usually includes urban rodents and a few birds that are considered pest species. So things like the rock pigeon or feral pigeon. The Javan myna is another species that can apparently be culled without any prior approval. So in Singapore, you are not allowed to catch any wild birds by yourself, but the Javan myna is not one of them that enjoys these protections. But the ironic thing is that in its native range. So the Javan myna is native to the islands of Java and Bali in Indonesia. But because of the demand for the songbird trade, the Javan myna has also been suffering from this widespread and rampant trapping for the cage bird trade in Indonesia. So in its native range, it is considered threatened. But here in Singapore, the ironic thing is it is so abundant that it's considered a pest. Yeah. So if you go to Bali or Jakarta, you can't see any Javan mynas for the most part. You need to go to the outskirts in the protected areas. But here in Singapore,
they're everywhere, man. Yeah.
You can only count like a few hundred of them if you spend the whole day walking around outside.
So I want to ask you a couple questions. So talk about what your job is. Go ahead. I mean, I know your title, but talk about what it's like to be an urban nature guide in Singapore.
All right. So I usually do guided walks for various clients. So for the most part, it's school students. So they usually, the teachers will normally organize field trips for them. So I will bring them around some of the green spaces, the parks and nature reserves, and teach them about things like what's biodiversity, talk to them about adaptations. It is often in line with the current curriculum for their lessons. So whether it's for science or geography and that sort of thing. I also get requests from clients who are from the corporate sector. So they are usually organizing a little outing for their work for their office. And then I'll bring them around and talk to them about why conservation is important even for an urban city like Singapore.
Yeah.
Then I also get some clients who are from the community groups. So these are usually on the weekends. So sometimes the neighborhood community centers, they'll organize guided walks for the residents. And so they'll all pile up into a bus, and then they will visit, let's say, Sungai Buloh, or maybe some of our other parks and nature reserves, and basically just spend a Sunday or Saturday morning just walking around and learning about some of the biodiversity that can be found in Singapore. And because a lot of these residents, they are from the older generations. So the thing about Singapore is that in the past, we urbanized very quickly in the last 50 plus years. So we have people still alive today who actually grew up in the rural village setting, who actually grew up like on the plant, who grew up on vegetable farms or chicken farms, that sort of thing. So most of those agricultural sector has been phased out. We do still have some farms, but they are mostly moving towards the high-tech style of farming. But we do still have a lot of people in Singapore who grew up in the rural Southeast Asian village setting, and then they were relocated and moved into public housing in the last 50 years after Singapore gained independence. So for a lot of these older residents, just going out with them into the nature reserves is often very educational for the guides as well, because they often share their own stories about how in the old days they used to eat this plant, or how they used to dig for clams in this area, and that sort of thing. So it's often it's a trip down memory lane for a lot of these older people.
I wanted to throw in just one last little topic before we say goodbye. So let's say 3 or 4 minutes, wild boar. Talk real quick. Wild boar, we love this topic, Tony and I do. So like, what are wild boar like in Singapore?
It's a very relevant topic right now because wild boar just made the news here in Singapore. So wild boar were considered locally extinct for some time in Singapore. They recolonized the mainland from our offshore islands to the north, and also most likely from swimming across from Malaysia. So they recolonized Singapore and they started spreading through our forests.
How far is it from Malaysia? How far a distance would that be there?
Not very far at all. People often try to swim across, and they get picked up by the Coast Guard. Yeah, it's easy for a large swimming or flying animal to just make the crossing like that. So
there's a bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have two causeways to Malaysia, but obviously not many people are using these causeways now in the time of the pandemic due to border restrictions. But
I was just saying that to Billy so he understands that like it's it's close enough that there's a land bridge.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of our wildlife is shared with Malaysia. As Malaysia is the southern coastline of Malaysia, the southernmost state of Peninsular Malaysia is called Johor. So Johor is rapidly developing and urbanizing as well, and we are receiving refugee species, animals that were once very rare in Singapore, and then came back from Malaysia, and now they are thriving here as well. So, for instance, species like the saltwater crocodile, the smooth-coated otters, the oriental pied hornbill, and the wild boar. These are all species that, for the most part, were considered either very rare or even locally extinct for some time. And so the wild boar came back. And right now, we don't really have that many large predators of wild boar here in Singapore. So historically, we would have the carnivores like the tiger and the leopard, but we shot all of them quite some time ago. The only things that could probably take a wild boar right now are probably very exceptionally large reticulated pythons. Maybe a crocodile would take one if a wild boar happened to be near the river or in the mangroves. And maybe a very, very bold pack of feral dogs might go for a piglet, for instance. But for the most part,
not much that doesn't amount to very much population control once they're there.
Yeah. So right now, the biggest population control of the wild boar in Singapore are human beings. So they are culled here and there in some places through cage traps and lethal injections. So we don't have hunting per se in Singapore. We do have poachers who will set cage traps and pitfall traps for wildlife, but those are pretty much quite rare and isolated cases for as far as we know. And of course, wild boar do run across the roads and get hit by cars and all that. So, but at the same time, there's a very interesting relationship between wild boar and people. So in some places, people have been feeding the wild boar. So they will come over. Idea. Yes. So some people, even in urban Singapore, they will drive over to a spot where the forest meets the sidewalk, literally. And then they will throw bags of rice and bread and potatoes, and the wild boar will just come out in the little herds and start feeding on whatever the people have given them. And so there was this incident recently where a woman who was just going for a stroll in a nearby park at night, she got charged by a wild boar apparently, and she got hurt quite badly, so I've heard. But then at the same time, this is considered very close to where a regular wild boar feeding site is. And so a lot of people have been citing that we have been clearing a lot of the remaining wild spaces. So a lot of parts of Singapore, they're not protected. These are places that were once occupied by villagers or agricultural land, and then they were abandoned. And in the meantime, the forest has kind of grown back, but they are earmarked for future developments, whether it's for housing or industry or commercial businesses. A lot of these unprotected areas have a limited lifespan. But in the meantime, animals like wild boar move in and they settle down over there. So as these places are cleared, wildlife gets displaced, so wild boar among them, but also feeding exacerbates the issue. And then they'll come out to the streets, they'll come out to the parks, and they will, because they have been habituated, they're not so scared of people. And so in some cases, they will actually come up to people and cause issues with residents. And so there's been some petitions going around to, save the wild boar, but then there's also been people calling up their representatives and saying, we want you to deal with the wild boar problem in our neighborhoods. So there's this tension going on right now with how do we manage wildlife actually once as large and contentious as wild boar.
No, it's tricky because it's I like to think of them as whitetail. Like we have white-tailed deer, right? And we have raccoons. And it's kind of like those, but bigger, and they can kill you potentially. So it's
I will also add, in lots of them in the United States, we have black bears in urban settings.
True. So it's a comparable kind of problem. Yeah.
And we also have our share of wild boars.
Yeah, your feral
Like in
hogs.
Dallas. No, Tony, you were thinking about that before. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen them down in Texas. Yeah.
Recently, there was this video that was going around where this, because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, people can't travel overseas. So there's been this huge surge of visitors to our parks and nature reserves and other green spaces. And a lot of these people, they don't really know how to deal with wildlife. So people have been unwittingly getting their food and drinks snatched by wildlife. In most places, it's the long tail macaques, right? Monkeys are a common sight in many of these forested areas. But in one of these green spaces on an offshore island of Singapore called Pulau Ubin, there is this herd of wild boar that's been habituated by years of regular feeding. And recently, this visitor, she had food in her bicycle basket, and the wild boar was actually going up towards her and snatched the food right out of the bicycle basket, while she was trying to steer the bicycle away from her. And then there are other videos of the wild boar pushing the bikes over and grabbing the food that's in them and all that. So this is not exactly urban, but this is an escalation of the old relationship between humans and wildlife, where it used to be, oh, we're so scared of them, will they attack us? And then on the other hand, you have people who feed them and then they become overly friendly. So there's this interesting, I would say, dilemma, how do you get people to not fear wildlife, but also not treat them as pets and feed them like that? So it's an issue that I think people here in Singapore have to learn to grapple with, because we like our greenery, we like our green spaces, but it comes with all this wildlife that is just trying to live among us.
Awesome. So I think that's a good place to end. Don't feed the wild boar.
Yeah, I think general rule of thumb is don't feed mammals. Feed birds. Some birds that have a bird feeder, fine, but stop with the birds. Don't feed any mammals. It's just the general good rule of thumb.
It's a very good rule. So
here in Singapore, by the way, we can't feed birds. Yeah.
You're not allowed?
You're not allowed to feed birds because they usually, if you do it in your kitchen window, you're probably just going to attract miners and pigeons and crows. But people still do that, and then that's when you get pigeon and miner and crow conflict going on in the urban areas. So it's illegal.
Well, then okay. Don't feed those either if you're in Singapore, but wherever you are, don't feed the boars.
Yeah.
So let's wrap it up, and I'll thank Ivan for getting in contact with us and joining us for this discussion. Tony, any final words?
I just want to thank you for sharing that with you. I think Singapore is it's a great city. I think people should definitely visit there and give Ivan a holler, go on a tour with him.